Hey, good afternoon.
Hi, Mitch. How are you?
Oh, busy.
Yeah,
We are full steam ahead on getting this thing prepared
yeah,
because that state tour. So,
yeah.
our-
The tour of a state is a pretty big deal.
yeah, yeah, and for a while there, it was kind of like whether or not there was up and down whether or not we were going to go. President Clean wasn't sure, and just like last week, he's like our green lighted and is like, okay, I think we're going to tail back all the big events and we'll do smaller things, because of all the COVID cases and whatnot. So, how have you been?
I've been okay, having a little trouble with Zoom. So
Oh
just
gosh.
to be a little safer, I'm going to make you a co-host in case something goes
Okay.
wrong with mine, just as a backup.
Okay.
I'm going to do that also with some of the participants, but we're having trouble. Terry's gone to the wrong site and, I
Yeah.
had my Zoom freeze up during Janet Smith's presentation.
Oh.
So, it's been one of those days.
My internet was actually doing that yesterday to me. I was hosting. Well, you've been on some of those with. I
Yeah,
think you were on the one with Teresa, and you have Rep Croak as well, right?
yes.
Yeah, you and I we live very close to each other. I'm in Buena Park, so I've got her for now at
Okay.
least. Yeah.
Mhm.
But yeah, mine was doing the same thing yesterday and had to make someone else a co-host so that the whole Zoom didn't close down when I left.
Yeah. Yeah. It works fine until it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just gonna check my email occasionally to see if I can get Terry to go to the right site.
Yeah, there should be an interesting conversation today.
Yeah.
Just I love the concept of scenescapes, like it just and scenes in just general. It's just a fun way to think about everything, really.
Yeah, we'll be working on that over two meetings, this one
Yeah.
and then with the other hosts, next week with Dan and Zach.
Yeah.
Remind me, did you figure out what you wanted to do about your paper? I know you had part of it and I just didn't get it recorded from the other day.
Yeah, I think it was going to do that financial analysis of of the suburbs, and I haven't read.
Okay.
I have a note for the gentleman you recommended finding his info on, but I hadn't
Okay,
done any research yet. Yeah.
that's just fine. I'm just trying to keep up with 20 students doing everything very
Yeah.
differently.
Yeah, I saw your note to the class, so sounds like everyone's getting started and thinking about what they're going to do, huh?
Yep. I had 3 sessions yesterday.
Oh man, yeah. Okay.
It takes one with each student, so
Yeah.
can go a little slowly. Yeah, I thought we cleared yours, but I wanted to make sure.
Yeah, thanks for checking.
Yep.
Hi, Yasmin.
Hi, Mitch. Hi, Professor Simpson.
Hello, Yasmin. Hi, Steve.
Hey.
Steve, I'm still waiting for Terry. He's on a different Zoom site by mistake, so we may end up starting. I've got a few announcements first, but we
That's
may
fine.
switch around.
That works, Dick.
Okay, yeah, and then while you're presenting, if it's still bad, I'll go off and try and get Terry to the right place.
That's okay. I completely understand.
Yeah.
You don't need me to send you my slides. You just give me
I'm
control
gonna-
and I can do from here.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give you co-hosting.
Thank you.
Whoops.
Thank you, Dick.
Yeah, this would be an exciting session. And I sent your slides also to the person who's working on the mayor's book, bibliography, so
Okay,
Clinton Stockwell.
good. Yeah, I want to get all that information out.
Yeah,
Doesn't do any good to keep it under a firewall at University of
No.
Oxford University Press.
particularly not that. No one will ever find it. Yeah.
I know.
Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. We've still got students checking in and we're waiting for our other presenter as well.
And I can go brief.
That's, we've got 2 hours and then I'll probably talk to the students some about their paper. So you don't have to go brief. I think it's helpful to get the historical perspective in early. Daniel, since you're on, Petty was at the department meeting today, and we're going to try and list on Blackboard material related to the Future Chicago speeches. If you need my help sending you that stuff, you can contact me directly.
Okay, great. And since you pointed me out, I'm going to put a link for an upcoming event on Mayor Washington's LGBTQ+ legacy
Okay,
that might be of interest to some people.
great. We're having a major event on campus October 5th of the Come Alive October 5. So I'll share that in a bit. It's still shaping up a little. And that's when they started the voter registration campaign for Harold. Okay, everyone, we're waiting just one more minute. Looks like we've got most of the class, so I'm going to start with some announcements. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So these are some events coming up on campus, and then I'll let Daniel re-announce again what he just posted. So Constitution Day was just over. We had 300 participants. Carol Mosley Braun was doing the talk. We will have available, if you missed it and want to see it, there is a recording which was made that's being made available to classes. So if you want to see the Carol Mosley Braun speech on race and the Constitution, you should be able to do that. The National Voter, for those of you that are on campus physically, National Voter Registration Day is September 28th from 11 to 1 on the quad. You may be interested, we're also part of a National Student Issues Convention, which is October 22nd from 12 to 3. Students from UIC, mostly undergraduates. We've not usually involved graduates except as sort of teaching assistants for it. But we're going to have more than 300 students from more than 15 states. I don't know exactly how many students. That depends on the registration. But it is an interesting event altogether, and I wanted to just simply let you know about it. So the Constitution Day recording we do have now, and I will try and share with you later by email the link if I haven't. The National Student Issues Convention we are starting to sign up for, but this is something for the graduate students, and you don't have to be in political science for this. The Illinois Political Science Association meeting is November 13th. It's a wonderful occasion. It covers history and sociology and geography and so forth, urban studies, public administration. Papers are presented by faculty and graduate students on a variety of topics. The topics include things like Chicago politics or Chicago studies, Illinois politics. It often has a panel on public administration. It has a panel related to political science theory and foreign policy, and often comparative politics. I'll come back to that in a minute because I have a slide to show you how to sign up for it. These are future Chicago speeches that we have at the university. Janet Smith spoke today on racial change and housing in Chicago in the post-pandemic era, and a couple of you did attend. You might be particularly interested. Next week is Dr. Allison Awardy, the Department of Public Health, talking about dealing with this stage of the pandemic and health disparities in Chicago and the 2025 plan to fix all of that. Chicago Coalition of the Homeless then follows. And then we have some authors and Scott Walsbach, who heads the finance committee, and the Chicago City Council. So I'm going to try and post all of this. It's a little hard with the links, but I just wanted to show you how simple it is for proposals to get your paper accepted at IPSA. This is the entire form. All you have to do is put your name, your graduate student, your field of study, and so forth, the title of your paper, and a 100-word abstract. And from that, they decide whether or not to allow you to participate. It is by far the easiest of the professional conferences that I know about that you can participate in and get the experience. It also helps with your CV in getting a job later. So I just want to alert you that those are coming. Daniel has posted in the chat, and Daniel, I'll let you unmute yourself and make the announcement.
Oh, the Center in Halstead is doing an event as part of the Washington Centennial on Harold Washington's LGBTQ+ legacy in policy. Thought it might be of interest to some people. Information's in the chat. It's on October 13th.
And just to let you know, by the centennial, what we mean is that Harold Washington, if he were alive, would be 100 years old this year. Okay, so Steve, we're going to let you go first, and I'm going to go off and see if I can find Terry Clark.
No, Terry's actually here.
Oh, okay, Terry, you wanted to go first.
He's on his iPhone though.
Yeah, let me fix it so Terry can share his screen, if that works.
Are you there, Terry? Because Terry just called me actually, and I said send
okay.
him a new link. And if he doesn't respond, I can go.
Terry, can you hear us? I think he dropped off again. I made him a co-host. No, he's a co-host. So Terry, are you there? Steve, we'll go ahead and let you start then, and bring Terry in when he gets it all lined up on his phone.
Okay, let me go to my screen. One moment, and let me see if you can all see this.
Steve is, his slide says professor of history at Columbia College and also a dean. So, hey, he hires people for real work.
That's true. That's a separate conversation. So I take it you can all see my screen. I will be rather brief. I apologize for the poor quality of slides. Even though I do teach at an art and media school, I'm none of those things. So I'm just a straight up historian. What I want to talk about are some key concepts in urban history, and I want to do that by going back to some of the material that we've already talked about, because I'm a social historian, which means I'm trained to take a look at society from the bottom up. And urban history has a very strong relationship with social history on many levels. So to answer the question of what is social history, I always answer it by the study of urban as a place, a process, or a way of life. And by using those three distinctions, I'm bringing in an interdisciplinary lens. And hopefully that'll become clear in a few moments. The subfield of urban history, however, it was very late to the American historical profession, and it emerged well after the establishment of the Chicago School of Sociology and the various Chicago schools that we've talked about so far in the class this semester. In fact, Richard Wade, who was a professor at the University of Chicago at the time, and then later a professor of history at CUNY, City University of New York, and Oxford, said, historians have arrived at the study of the city by slow freight. Okay. So the roots of urban history are that they borrow, urban historians have always borrowed heavily from other scholars and other disciplines, notably sociologists, as well as from a body of work in the 19th century that documented social issues. And so the rise of the city, of the modern industrial city in the 19th century, saw the emergence of social concerns or social problems, I'll put those in quotation marks, especially in fields of public health, poverty, and crime. And so this type of work became very influential in not just the historical profession, but actually in the formation of even the discipline of political science. Many things came together to create social science as we know it now, but there's a very strong roots of social science in reform and advocacy, which took on a larger political agenda as the 19th century increased. In 1865, the American Social Science Association was formed by a bunch of reformers. And they published their own Journal of Social Science, which published work by Frederick Douglass, Florence Kelley, Charles Loring Brace, W.D. Du Bois. And this association was part of the larger process of the 19th century of different aspects or different participants in society documenting change that had been brought about by the rise of cities and the rise of urbanization at a quick pace. And it's important to note that the United States in the 19th century rapidly becomes a leading urbanized nation. Cities grow at an astronomical rate, and they grew in places where they had not existed before. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment when I talk about some of my own work. But the American Social Science Association spun off into different groups. It was an organization that was an umbrella organization for social reformers. And then they spun off things like the National Prison Association, American Health Association, American Historical Association, American Economics Association, APSA, American Political Science Association, and American Sociological Association. So this, I wanted to point out that this is a very strong part of early academia. It's all about reform and advocacy for change. The other tradition that comes together that heavily influences urban historians and the subfield or the field of urban studies, which I'll talk about in a moment, was the tradition of journalists practicing what we call muckraking, or documenting or often sensationalizing a social issue, especially political corruption. That had a huge influence. Also, the social settlement movement, which is famous here in Chicago for Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, founding of Hull House. And social settlements were places where predominantly middle and upper class men and women, mostly women, would move into an urban neighborhood to experience the problems of the new conditions of urban life, especially immigrant neighborhoods and poorer neighborhoods, and work in the communities to help the residents sort of negotiate space and, put it clearly, help them become middle class and help them assimilate into American culture. Another movement that's very important is the social survey movement at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And the most famous is the Pittsburgh survey that the Russell Sage Foundation funded, which was to document various aspects of modern industrial urban life, from wage earning to housing conditions to public health conditions to things also like the labor, child labor, women working. And almost every major American city had a survey done by an organization or multiple surveys on issues. And these are great source books for historians to take a look at how issues were framed by contemporaries at the time, especially those engaged in defining what an issue was and in working on social reform. So I have here just a list of, I call these influential texts that have really helped shape how urban history evolves and also the field of urban studies. And I should point out that before I came to Columbia 9 years ago, I was a professor of urban studies at Worcester State University in Massachusetts. And I'll talk a little bit in a bit about the origins of the urban studies movement, but these influential texts are probably things many of you have read, and they are key and really good examples of how social problems were defined. And I'll just go through a few of them briefly. Jacob Riis's famous work, How the Other Half Lives, still stands as one of the most influential texts about how housing was documented and the conditions that people lived in the tenements in New York City in the late 19th century. He wasn't the only person to do this. In fact, he wasn't very original in many ways, but he gets a lot of credit because he was able to master the use of photography, which later, many of you probably read How the Other Half Lives, and those photographs were added later. Originally, it had halftone drawings. Jane Addams, Hull House Maps and Papers. This is a fabulous source of these colorful maps, and I think we've actually had this in class, so I won't go into it any further, but illustrating where different ethnic groups lived in the city of Chicago. Then Lincoln Steff's The Shame of the Cities, which documented political corruption. And then the other ones are I won't get into too much detail, but they all document a part of urban life in either London, which is the case of Charles Booth, or Philadelphia. We've already talked about the city. And then also another one that's very important, I would argue, is Middletown by Robert and Helen Lind, which was a study of Muncie, Indiana. And so this sets the stage for the fact that urban historians really haven't done, or up until the 1940s, really had not done systematic studies of urban life. They had done stories about certain parts of cities. Maybe boosterism is a good way to look at it, celebrating certain cities or certain people, especially white men in cities. And that begins to change in the 1940s and 50s. And I just also have two others on here that I want to note. The St. Clair Drake and Horace Clayton Black Metropolis, a study of Negro life in Northern City. That's Chicago. And then also Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. These are, I'll refer back to these and through the rest of the presentation. So, urban history, really one of the very few works that you could consider urban history before the 1940s and 50s was Arthur M. Schlesinger Sr.'s The Rise of the City. And yes, that's the father of Arthur Schlesinger Jr., which probably many of you have read. He's also a very influential political historian. In the 1960s, and there was a new emphasis in academia and it caught on in American history by taking a look at data, crunching numbers, crunching data, quantitative analysis, especially of census returns and anything that could be coded. This is, of course, that now there's supercomputers on campuses that you can punch into the cards. If any of you have ever seen, I should say, I don't think anyone's used those except maybe Dick and I. IBM punch cards that has lots of data on it. So this brought a new way of looking at urban, by looking at it as a process, by looking at it as different types of activity coming together that define an area as urban. And some of the notable works here, and I don't expect anyone to have ever read these, but they're very important. There's Richard Wade, again, who wrote The Urban Frontier, The Rise of Western Cities. And this really is a path-breaking work because he argues, in contrast to dominant American history, that it was the town that came before the agricultural settlement, that cities were the pathfinders of civilization, that as what we call the Midwest today, or the West back then, as it was founded, it wasn't founded with this sort of mythology of frontiersmen going out and taming the wild. It was, no, actually they formed towns and cities, and from there, the American frontier was settled. Some of the other work, Sam Bass Warner, a very famous work, Streetcar Suburbs, of the process of urban growth through transportation networks. And then most influential probably be in terms of behavior would be Stephen Thernstrom's Poverty and Progress, and also the other Bostonians, where census data in Newburyport, Mass. And Boston, Mass. Are looked at to examine questions of social and economic mobility. Well, the new urban history really didn't catch on in the American historical profession. As appealing as it is to some people to do quantitative analysis, I even did some in graduate school, it really got subsumed by two other movements. One is urban studies and the other is social history. Let me turn to urban studies. In the 1960s and 1970s, as American cities were going through a period of perceived urban decay, I say that's my New York school here, perceptions of urban decay. And also it's been called the long urban crisis. There was a response to this by scholars to engage in multidisciplinary projects to sort of address changes in cities, to try to address both from a planning perspective, the decay of the city, and also from issues of social equity, to take a look at the role of government. And so these urban studies projects at American universities and also in government really were focusing on the role of government and local community empowerment. And these things were part of the New Deal, the War on Poverty, wrong president, War on Poverty, and attempts to rejuvenate cities. And this resulted in large part, or one of the reasons for the rise of urban studies programs across the United States. The program that I taught in Worcester, Mass. Was formed in, I think, 68 or 69 as an urban education project to sort of take, to work with the public schools in Worcester to excite students about civic engagement in the community, in the schools, and to sort of a way to revitalize the city. Oh, and now it's not working. There we go. Now, new social history. So back to the historical profession. What happens in the late 1960s and early 70s is that there's an explosion of scholarship. That's called the new social history. Again, this is my training of examining history from the bottom up. And it quickly consumed the field of urban history and other subfields, and became really the dominant field in the American historical profession until about, I would say about 20 years ago. Well, I got out of grad school longer than 20 years ago, but when I was in graduate school, it was the dominant field. And it took a look at issues of race, class, gender, and now has expanded to gender, sexuality, heavy emphasis on immigration and ethnicity in an urban setting, as well as metropolitanization and sort of regional processes that would lead naturally enough to suburban history as well. And what's striking about the social history is the use of many different sources, not only in addition to census material and quantitative material, also taking a look at a broad variety of things, such as oral histories, traditional reliance upon government reports and newspapers, but other ways to get at cultural expression and to get at agency of people living in urban communities, and taking a look at how ordinary people, I use that word sort of in a non-elite context, non-academic context, but how people define themselves and their agency in terms of living in the city. So this is a heavy emphasis on ways of life. Now, here's my book, one of my books I'm working on right now, and I just wanted to present this. This is America's Urban History. This came out in 2015. And this is, I wrote this book with my colleague, Lisa Kristof-Behm, and it's a synthesis of American urban history that actually recenters American history away from the dominant, what I would call the continental narrative or the agrarian narrative, and actually puts urban at the center. Now, I'm currently working on a second edition for this. I have a book contract, so sometime this next year, I have to deliver a revision of this. But we start by taking a look at urbanization itself. Urbanization is both a place, a process, and way of life. And we go to Native American settlements because urbanization predates European settlement. Although traditionally it isn't taught that way, it's taught as a recent product of industrialization and 19th century forward. So this book places urban at the center. And what we do is we actually tell the story of what becomes the United States through cities, and through the expansion outwards to connections in a metropolitan focus. And so for me, that ties in with what the preschool is all about, because we're re-envisioning not only putting cities in the center, but the success of urban life in the center, and the fact that cities work, the cities built, or urbanization builds the modern United States. But in contrast to a lot of previous ways of describing American history, we show the warts and all. I mean, we talk all about issues of exploitation and power and all of the contemporary concerns that have come out of social and political movements that have imbued social history. It's throughout this book. So this is my way of arguing that urban history is incredibly relevant to not only the way we live now, but we can also go back and re-examine past ways of life and past relationships that have taken place, not just in the United States, but throughout history. And in this period, since I've been engaged in this project, it really started in 2010 with an anthology that I can show you the anthology later. I've noticed that many, it's not surprising that different disciplines, especially social science disciplines, there are lots of trends, things that become popular. And now in archaeology, there's a really big movement to examine Native American cities. The Cahokia, which was a settlement just outside of St. Louis, is really the tip of the iceberg. They're discovering more and more settlements that were pretty large in their day, and in many cases on par with European cities in terms of their population. So I would argue you can reinterpret history through the urban. And I do want to show you one more. This is something, and I'll get to Chicago now. There's a new book out that I have a chapter in, and I apologize for the blurry image, called City of Lake and Prairie, Chicago's Environmental History. And this may be of interest to some of you because it talks about the relationship of the city to, of course, the natural environment and how it has been reshaped by human agency, And it starts with a very compelling chapter on indigenous communities and how American Indians actually shaped the prairie, which many of us believe is a sort of a natural phenomenon. And in fact, it is a product of human creation in the ways in which Native Americans use the land for hunting and also other purposes. And it goes right up to the present, and there's lots of public policy. I have a chapter here on air and water pollution in the 1970s, on efforts, communities, and community coalitions. I think I've even put Dick in here. I don't think, Dick, I told you that, in your role as an alderman. But this book is a really good source book for those of you who may want to work on Chicago local environmental issues and politics. And it's just came out it came out last December, University of Pittsburgh Press. So I think I'll stop right there and answer any questions. And hopefully it wasn't all that boring. And I don't expect there to be any questions, but if anyone has any questions, I can entertain them at this time.
And if Terry Clark and Zach Taylor want to hop in and talk about it from their point of view, that's fine. Any questions to Steve?
Okay.
I have a question. So I saw that in one of the slides you mentioned that the methodology was more empirically focused in like the 60s and 70s, and then it started to move away from that more towards, I think you said, ground up type of analysis. What does that mean in practical terms, in terms of how you demonstrate some fact or truth within the research that you're putting out, or what was being put out?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I probably should have mentioned this, prior to the new urban history and the emphasis on quantitative analysis, historians tended to stick to archives. They tended to use the writings of elites in society. And then the new slowly throughout the early 20th century, again, because of those issues that I talked about, there was a reliance upon journalism, again, still sort of a corporate lens. So after the quantitative analysis, which was really exactly, I think how you put it was really, really good. They're trying to take the factual data and they're trying to make sense of, because census returns are very localized, but at least they're fairly uniform, at least from one census done across an entire region. And so it was a way to try to look at change over time using some pretty clear and universal benchmarks. That hasn't disappeared, but now in the historical profession especially, we use a grab bag of techniques. And what I mean by that is when I do work, and my environmental work especially, I take a look at government, I take a look at public policy, I take a look at planning. So I'm looking at government reports, I'm looking at the same type of information that would go into a policy analysis and that would go into examining how issues are framed and the politics and the discourse around it. So that takes me to many different places. But there is still an emphasis for many historians, especially urban historians. We still use a great deal of census returns. But what doesn't happen very often, and one of the things that I have to be somewhat careful about this is I'll take a look at how urban was defined over a longer period of time, because it actually sort of changes generation by generation over what is something's considered urban. But yes, we still do use it, but there's now a greater emphasis on oral histories, using writings of communities that are being researched and giving voice from the bottom up. And that's probably how I should have explained that. It's by looking at communities on their terms and then analyzing the input that they've had. They're not just people who've been impacted by history, they make history as well. And so that has provided a really dynamic range of results of history books. And again, historians, taking that large picture is fine, but you really want to get an argument out. So you really will concentrate on a certain methodology or a certain set of sources that you find the most fruitful.
Steve, one of the things you sent out was the list of Chicago history books by Dominic Besegan, who was your colleague at Columbia. And it's been said, I'm not sure it's true, that Chicago is the most studied city in America.
It is.
And we have a whole host of historians, many of whom in the later years were trained at UIC. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the role of the Chicago historians and the Chicago urban historians and Chicago history.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Chicago is the most studied city in America. I remember I was in graduate school at New York University, and when Thomas Bender, well-known American historian, said that, I was like, what? Are you kidding? And he said, no, it's true. And it has it's for those factors we've talked about earlier in the class about the Chicago schools. And Richard Wade was at the University of Chicago. And so in no small way, in terms of urban history, Chicago sets the standard. Chicago really, what happens in Chicago and the way in which those issues are examined by scholars and framed really does set the tone for how American urban history, there's early American urban history, which is mostly East Coast elite sort of colonial history. And then there's what comes out of the Chicago academics. And to a remarkable extent, when I moved here, I realized not only how much I knew about the city already, and why I knew about it, because I'd been reading about it for decades. And then a very good point, Dick, the list that I sent around, I asked Dominic Pasiga, who's a noted Chicago historian, what he considers to be the most important books that would relate to especially to politics and to the evolution of the city. And it's remarkable that many of those books are published by the University of Illinois or Northern Illinois. So there's a homegrown community that has sort of, University of Chicago Press still dominates urban history, along with Princeton Press, a few others. But also at the local level, the scholars, especially at UIC and a few other communities. Now I work closely with scholars at Loyola because I'm an environmental historian. There's Harold Platt was at Loyola University, who published a fantastic book, a comparative history of Chicago and Manchester. It's called Shock Cities, and it's about the creation of modern, the rise of Chicago and modern Manchester as an industrial city, doing comparisons. There's also Timothy Guilfoyle, who is at Loyola, and I put in the large bibliography, the annotated bibliography. He has come up with a couple of major works, but one of the areas that I think is also pretty important is in the anthologies and encyclopedias. Chicago historians have been really been taking a lead, along with a handful of New York historians, bringing these encyclopedias out to a larger audience. So the Encyclopedia of Chicago, many of you probably used it. It's a really fascinating interactive, interactive in terms of being able to use it online, a source book. So Chicago historians continue. University of Chicago Press, like I said, their Urban Life series is really the press that you want to get on if you're an urban historian. And at every conference, Chicago historians are taking the lead, especially in the Urban History Association. So I don't know, Dick, I don't know if there's anything more you wanted me to say about that.
Other questions for Steve?
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Terry, can you unmute and I'll you're a co-host, so you can share your screen.
Excellent. Yeah, sorry, I had too much. I must have had an old address. I was the only person connected at 10 minutes before the class, and then Steve sent me the updated address. So apologies. I have several remarks. Some are more specifically Chicago, others are more generally urban. And I want to build directly on what Dick said in the first session, stressing the old Chicago school and the differences from the new, as well as the big themes that Steve stressed in history, that history is, however, too vague in general. And so getting to the specifics, as Steve is talking about the types of sources, the evidence, the kinds of rationales, I'll basically extend that, but try to make it more explicitly linked to social science concepts as they can empower the different kinds of evidence that we have. So I think what I'll do nevertheless is just mention one or two big themes about Chicago, then move to more general aspects of scenescapes, and then come back and then try to continue the discussion as we're having it right now, which is great. I will have two basic points to make, just to link to the history and the past of the old Chicago school. And I'll focus on one of the 2 or 3 top geographers in the world, who was Brian J.L. Barry. And he was here at Chicago when I first arrived, as were the historians, some that you heard discussed there, as well as at UIC. What's his name, who did the thesis on the bars? You mentioned Dick last time. UIC historian who trained lots of Chicago folks at UIC.
Mel Holly and
Mel Holly. So Mel Holly's books are fantastic. His thesis was his PhD was 1,000 pages. I was on his committee, and it's on the bars and how they're politically linked, etc. So these are interconnected, and including and I left New York to come here to work in a context where we had the best social scientists in the world working on cities. So the background, I'm mentioning Brian Barry, as well as in my courses, I mentioned many of the same names that Steve did, the Robert and Helen Lind, etc. But if we take Barry, the first half of his career was devoted to analysis of the old Chicago school ideas. And he then put these together and said, how well do these ideas explain the land value of parcels in the Chicago metro area? And he repeated this analysis, and I will show it to you in just a second. It's a very powerful. I'll try to share my screen here. If I can do this, what am I doing here? I'm trying to.
Should be a green tab below.
Should be.
I think you have to make him a co-host. He's on. Do you have the iPhone as a co-host?
I have
host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay.
I have your iPhone, and I have you.
Yeah, no, I'm not using the iPhone. Yeah, we want my regular computer. That's part. I have 2 connections.
Okay.
One is the iPhone, and we want the other, not the iPhone.
Great. 1 second. You are now a co-host.
Okay, great. Let's try that. Okay, there we go. All right, I want to click on my PowerPoint over here, and then share this. And the reason, okay, so then I'll just go down to, whoops, I don't want to do that yet. I want to share, I want to undo that. I want to unshare that. Stop that share. And I want to screen share, that's now working, with the Barry, here we go. Barry, which is, all right, so everybody see that? Okay, I'm scrolling up to this is a Geographic Perspectives on Urban Systems. Do everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. 1970, at this point, he was shocked at the finding, which is right here. He put together, what are the major explanations of land value? And the Burgess idea was in concentric zones, those areas right at the center have the highest land value. And so distance from the center should have the biggest impact. And that's to, so the dependent variable is front foot land value, distance to central district, then the distance to the nearest regional shopping center, distance to Lake Michigan, distance to the nearest elevated train or subway, population density, non-white. Okay, so these other variables were added by other folks after Burgess, but working as collaborators, trying to get the factors are there. Okay, the two big findings which I want to stress are, first, how strong, look at this line here at the bottom. You see my cursor? It's in, and this shows the strength between all of these and all of the variables in the equation. So what this says, in 1910, this was a strong model. It decreased in every decade up to 1960. So by 1960, these variables only explain roughly, this essentially, I think this is sort of 4% of the variance. Well, it's a similar statistic to that. Or just look at the individual coefficients. For the distance to the center, it goes from 0.83 in 1910 to 0.17 in 1960. So this was background which led Barry to say, okay, I'm giving up on the old Chicago school. I'm stopping following those core ideas. And instead, what do we need? Culture, politics, and policy, which are omitted by the traditional 1920s focus on so-called human ecology, adapting that from Darwin and the study of animals. But as people become less like, even immigrants to Chicago become less like animals, and they get more educated, more affluent, more engaged, even in occasionally some civic organizations, things begin to change. But I'm adding that quietly, civic organizations, I'll talk about in a minute. But Tocqueville didn't work. Tocqueville didn't visit Chicago, and Chicago didn't exist in the way that it challenges Tocqueville's analysis of America more generally. Okay, so let me just show one more related to that, which the share screen. I now go to my PowerPoint, which is here. And this share is now on. And I now go down to this one. This is the same thing for the Irish. What was the impact of the Irish on spending? And this is now in all of the American cities that were studied by the census from the period in 1880. Sorry, it's a little bit small. I don't know if I can make this. I don't know if is this going to muck it up if I make it large. Is this changing it, or is it just the same size?
Oh, it's not changing it, and it's
Not
sideways,
changing.
so
Okay.
it's not readable.
Yeah, okay. So the numbers are small, but basically it's the same story as Brian Barry's. That the Irish had a big impact on police and fire spending, not just in Chicago, but across, comparing Chicago and all the American cities for which we had data, which were 24 at the beginning in 1880 and 51 in 1968. But basically, the Irish were strongly significant through this period, but after 1968, it became insignificant. So there was a substantial change. Okay, why are the so I had this finding, and I thought initially, oh, I don't have enough variables. It isn't modeled right. And I was a young assistant professor. I didn't want to publish anything too wild. So I waited 5, 6, 7 years. I think it was 5 years. And I got invited. I talked about it occasionally to Andrew Greeley, and he started a journal called Ethnicity, and he said, "Why don't you do a paper in ethnicity?" I said, "I'll do it only if you help me, work through some of these things that are unclear." So he was writing about the Irish. He's a pre-sociologist, was, infamous, and writing a column that was syndicated in, hundreds of cities across the country. And so we exchanged many emails. It came out, and it's immediately the Irish groups in New York and Boston wrote to the University of Chicago and said, fire this guy. and then Daniel Patrick Moynihan, well, because the Boston Globe, the leading newspaper, had a big summary of it, and they completely made it into an anti-Irish attack in the press. I had never criticized the Irish in the paper at all. I said, look at the important things they're doing, but understand why and how it works. And the title of the paper was The Irish Ethic and the Spirit of Patronage. And so patronage, corruption, clientelism are different words which can be more analytical or more journalistic, moralistic, critical. Okay, so the Moynihan, in turn, to try to make up for this, invited me to give the last lecture in his last class at Harvard before he retired to the US Senate and was a politician for the rest of his life. But he'd written some of the best stuff in the Irish earlier. So he was in sync with all of this. And it went well. Okay, but I'm still criticized and amused or cited by amused people like Aaron Vildovsky, who say, how can this be true? It's just to say the Irish are that important is ridiculous. Anybody can see that, but he was wrong. So people who seriously reanalyzed the data, and this happened by two different groups seriously at Harvard and another one, found they agreed with me when they looked at the data more closely, that within Massachusetts, within Chicago neighborhoods, across the US with national data for cities, the same basic finding held. Then we went into more, to make it into a more qualitative sense, how does it work? What are the specifics? We went into case studies of the cities with the highest Irish populations, Boston, New York, Albany, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. And those have been documented by historians about how did the Irish do this. And so in the case of, we got the names of every city government official in Albany, coded them by ethnic background, and the percent Irish exploded after World War I when the veterans came back and the Dan O'Connell and his brother became the political leaders of Albany. I asked Daniel Patrick Moynihan if he had gone personally to get the okay from Albany, from O'Connell before he ran for Senate, and he shook his head quietly. So the state leadership of the Democratic Party in all of New York was led by, or at least had to have the approval of Dan O'Connell. With Moynihan as a dramatic illustration. Okay, why do I stress this? These are the key rules of old Chicago politics, which Dick captured as well eloquently in his book on the history of the City Council of Chicago. And he shows how the City Council had a handful of reformers, 2 or 3, usually in Hyde Park and maybe in Lincoln Park now and then, until Dick Simpson came along. He fought with Daley. He then left the council and went to UIC. But after the election of Harold Washington, reform has become a major player in Chicago politics and culture. And so why and how has this change happened? And I've said this with our group 20 years ago when we started, 15, 20 years ago with Denny Judd, Dick, and so Dick would listen, but and then I was doing an oral history with Bill Grimshaw, we'll talk about in November. Bill completely disagreed. And so when we first taught this course, we had amazing, wonderful disagreements I saying, you know, clientelism is being attacked. Dick Simpson is not alone. This is happening in Chicago. It's also happening nationally. And these debates are illuminating around not just the US, but Beijing, Paris, Milan, Naples, etc., Bogota. So I will leave it at that. We can come back, but this is elaborated in, you know, the paper on the Irish, but used then in other sources as well. I've got more specific links to Chicago history, but let me give you a little more the more general story, and then and build on these PowerPoints with it. Okay. Since 1968 and 89, we see complex confrontations among citizens, civic groups, unions, and traditional political parties. New types of groups and political leaders press for more ambitious policies like diversity and immigrant rights. The new social movements, environmentalists, feminists, human rights, paved the way in the 70s, but the 21st century went much further after Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, the Occupy movements from Wall Street to hundreds of others, the fall of national leaders in Cairo, Kiev, and more, with repercussions from Buenos Aires and Hong Kong. The new movements of many subpopulations implement protests, parades, demonstrations with puppets and poets, songs, dances created and directed carefully for videos of mass and social media. The Hollywood-style destruction of the World Trade Center and similar Parisian events orchestrated violence theatrically. These created new powerful scenes. Political responses to these include the new populist leaders from Greece and Brazil, the Philippines, Kiev, to Mayor Ford of Toronto, and Donald Trump. Why do social scientists talk about this? As analysts, what do they say? That is, as analysts, not just as moralists. Most social science writing is moralistic, just like the news media and the public media. The theories of the crowd of the 19th century remain way underdeveloped, but we study all kinds of things in the social sciences. But if you look at the key explanations used by the most social scientists, race, class and professional activity, gender, nationality of origin are the four essential characteristics to explain dozens of topics, from participation in politics and religion to happiness and more. The mass media mobilize these four with specific events. Race, especially class, race and class in Chicago are on the tube nonstop. But look more closely at all the social science journals for the precise power of these factors, and the four seldom explain more than 15% of the variations within the US or within a nation. This means 85% of the variance remains unexplained. These points are detailed in my books on the city as an entertainment machine and the new political culture. These fit directly with what I showed you from Brian Barry and my paper on the Irish, that we need to be more multi-causal and modest. Alas, the modesty of these results is largely ignored by many talented commentators such as Pierre Bourdieu, Jean-Claude Passeron in Les Héritiers and Distinction, Paul DiMaggio, Sharon Zukin, many more. We live in a highly probabilistic and weakly deterministic world, especially comparing nations. But one solution is to go down to cities and then below them to neighborhoods, where we get more homogeneity and we can strengthen. And I've lived in Bronzeville the whole time I've been in Chicago, half a century or almost, and seeing things with subtlety in Bronzeville. I'm meeting with the Aldermanic Advisory Committee for over all the stuff with Michael Reese Hospital. These bring out, and Chicago was no longer is, but was the most densely Black, had the most dense Black neighborhood, and more than Detroit, more than Gary in the early 20th century. And so Chicago and Harlem are the homes of Black culture, and we're proud of it. I'm co-author. What I've spent in the last couple of years is writing on Bronzeville soul with ministers and others in Bronzeville. A few persons are stressing new topics and processes beyond the traditional: public art, public space, creative placemaking, new migration dynamics, neighborhood associations are all here. And in this spirit, my first goal here is to compile or to present a list of concepts we can specify that help specify dynamic, changing urban processes. Second, to sketch an approach which joins with many more specific processes. And third, some results comparing cities around the world. The approach I'm highlighting, beginning, because you're going to have more from Zach, who's here today, Dan Silver and others. It seeks not to replace, it's called the scene. The scene analysis in the Scenescapes book on your reading list seeks not to replace, but to add to the classic concepts like class, race, and so forth, and to enrich the social science toolbox, adding more historical specifics linked to these, as you heard from Steve. Since the '68 uprisings, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Tiananmen protests of 1989, the world has deeply changed. Yet many social scientists and historians, and I would say the historians are learning faster perhaps, they started before the sociologists on the importance of consumption in the arts and still are there. If we've gone beyond just Adam Smith, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. If we add urban theorists like Zimmel, the Chicago 20 ecologists, the early Marxist Castells, Logan and Molich's urban fortunes, we still have the heavy imprint of business dominance, capitalism, class. How to update our theories. About half of the manual labor force has disappeared since the 1950s in Europe and North America, compromising the Marxist analysis of industrial society. Half the manual labor force is gone. We live in an increasingly post-industrial world with new roles for cities. Students are the new proletariat. You're the drivers. Creativity, ideas, and culture have become essentials. We have to catch up to the public, to the journalists, and a handful of political leaders building on '68 and '89. Chinese designers, Korean and Japanese cultural policies are transforming Asian export production economies and central planning to a new focus on consumption through the arts, targeted directly by strong governments. In China, mass rural-urban migration is not motivated by employment alone. Younger people in Asia challenge their families and other hierarchies far more visibly and actively than we do in the US. The urban scenes of big cosmopolitan cities attract the young and talented. Beijing is seriously pursuing nightlife as a new urban policy. Chicago's not there yet. We tried and it didn't work very much. New issues such as limiting environmental pollution, dealing with flood victims, and combating corruption have transformed the focus on economic growth. Okay, I'll come back to this with China and the others, but for now, I'll contrast with the European.
Terry, if we could, we usually take a break at this point for about 15 minutes. Can we do that?
That would be fine. That'd be fine
Okay.
right now if you want.
Okay, so we'll take a break for 15 minutes. We'll come back at 5:15 and Terry will continue and we'll open up the conversation after his presentation. Thank you all.
Very good.
Hello, Dick.
Hi there,
Zach here.
Zach. How are you doing? Glad to
I'm
have
very
you join
good.
us today.
Yeah, it's been fun to tune in. Of course, I'm a big fan of both of your keynote people today. So, yeah, I definitely have a better idea of sort of the way you've organized things, and I'm looking forward to kind of pitching it properly next week.
Good, and I'll try and share your other document with the students. I didn't want to overload them with it today since they were getting a lot of other information.
Yeah, and of course, I'm interested in I want to hear what you think about just what fell out of it in Chicago, just the way the racial organization of the council fell out of the analysis. Is this like a bad analysis, or does the analysis get at something that's real?
Let me take a look at it more closely. I've been swamped, but I will get to it
I'm
before
sure.
next week.
Just you are the one person in the world who will be able to comment on this. So
Yeah, you've seen our,
So
I can't remember, you've seen our latest paper that's on the UIC Chicago Politics site on
is
Lori
there a new
Lightfoot.
edition?
There's a number 12, and I can't remember whether you had seen the earlier one about a manual on Lightfoot, I think, but this is one that's even later.
Yeah, I went through them all about 6 months ago. So if there's
Yeah,
a
no,
newer
there are
one, I
two,
haven't
then
seen it
there are
yet.
two that
Okay.
are later than that. So if, you know, just so you can compare what we found with roll call votes with what you're finding, if, you know, to the extent you go through either a manual or Lightfoot.
Okay, great. I will, I'll follow that up. Eventually we have to figure out how to get it into a shape where we can publish it. So
Well, look,
the more work.
looked at it for that perspective, it looked to me like it would go, just the fact that you're doing the two cities and that you're using the use of the quantitative data. I don't see any, at least with the urban journals, I don't see any problem like with Urban Affairs Review or the UAA journal.
Yeah,
Get it into a mainline journal is really tough, and I don't have an answer to that.
I know. I think we'll try that first, though. I'd really like to try.
Yeah.
Before we. I can't have all my articles published in Urban Affairs Review.
Yeah, I understand.
All right.
Yeah, I don't even know which one to tell you of the main ones. The one published by the Midwest Political Science Association is probably a little more penetrable than the other one. Looks like Terry is queuing us up. Terry will be just 2 minutes and we'll be ready to go again.
Anytime, anytime. Yeah, this I'm mentioning here, this includes a PowerPoint from Dan Silver. So we share things with Dan, and he will be talking to you directly with Zach, who's done some wonderfully original work on Chicago and with major international and national implications as well, connecting these links.
So when we start back up, let's go for another hour, and then I need to take 15 minutes with the students and to talk to them a little bit about their papers. And as far as I know, we don't have anyone from the U of C who's been attending the course. So I'm uncertain about that, but we can try and check on it. Betty has had a family emergency, so I can't rely on her to find out, but I'll try and find out.
Yeah, the classes are not beginning until next week at the USC. So all these earlier classes, they will rely on the recordings. And so if you can make the recordings accessible outside UIC.
Yeah, we're putting them on YouTube. We're having some trouble. We've got the first two up.
Okay, no, that's great. So people are talking about registration right now and shifting shopping among different classes,
Yeah.
et cetera.
So let me know if any of them decide they are doing it, and are posting it on YouTube as well as on our own UIC Blackboard site. But we're way behind on YouTube because of some technical problems that we can talk about offline. Why don't we get started? So we're going to go another hour between Terry and Steve. We'll start with Terry and then get into a more general conversation and questions and discussion with the 21 of you that are on the site at the moment and the class. And so Terry, we'll pick up with your narration.
You see here some pictures simplifying the kind of debates and the characterizations of class and of capitalism. A major subtle addition was Paris, and Walter Benjamin transformed a lot of theorizing, but only slowly, as it was recognized how fundamental a transformation he had brought to Marxism of saying the flaneur, the guy with the top hat and the umbrella, is really a driver of the economy, not just a proletarian or someone who is exploited. And so we have transformations from the 19th century. These were major forces, but they're also being revised with some folks here who stressed, from Balzac, Baudelaire, the importance of creativity as a driver of cities. And then we'll get to these people in just a minute. But let me talk here. We're in Southern Europe. Roman law and the Catholic hierarchy, and this is the core of the Irish ethic argument, were the sources of many theorized past models, and Frankfurt was seen as new. One day, I was a student of Adorno when he said, quote, "You felt Hitler's boot, but Horkheimer and I went to the United States where it was even worse. People there did not realize that they were forced to smoke cigarettes, to see Hollywood movies, to ride in big cars, and lead a lifestyle imposed by advertising," unquote. And this is elaborated in their famous Hollywood article, which you may have read. But remember, though, the second face of Adorno is that of a subtle, critical, and nuanced atonal composer of music. I propose we pass over the first Adorno and extend the second. We must introduce the aesthetic and emotional power of the arts into our central thinking to better interpret how cities and citizens do so today. Why did Adorno stress advertising? Because it makes a direct link between capitalism and the consumer. It destroys consumer autonomy and individualism introduced by Walter Benjamin, with the flaneur as a causal social engine. Benjamin's in-depth study of Paris has global significance now in our post-industrial era, and his Paris is an answer. Ad shopping, entertainment, consumption, lifestyles, cafes, the poetry of Baudelaire, which distilled the elements of street life, the recognition of Benjamin as the leading intellectual of Weimar Republic, and Baudelaire as the most respected cultural model of late 19th century France, suggests that smart citizens surpass the simple deterministic social theorists, then stressing race, class, and materialism. Likewise, Baudelaire himself edited the Journal of Wagner Studies. Wagner wrote 5 volumes of prose before completing his most important music in the Ring of the Nibelung. He destroyed the classic tradition from Bach to Mozart to Beethoven, and his concept of the total artwork, the Gesamtkunstwerk, integrated huge numbers of little themes. There were thousands of themes in his music. There were thousands of ideas. There were themes like jealousy, hatred, resentment, love, etc. but they come together with the sounds and with the text and the action on the stage. And so that made the holism, the holistic conception central. This in turn, if we don't want to cite Wagner, which we don't, I usually don't for political sensitivity reasons, cite instead the Jewish, French leading anthropologist, probably in all of world history of anthropology, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who says in the first preface of his 4-volume work on myth that his major inspiration for this work is Richard Wagner. So Lévi-Strauss takes these ideas and joins them with Brazilian myths in a highly creative way that anthropologists and many others can use, and we can build on, as we do in Scenescapes in the book. Production, social relations, focus on producing goods and services remain the foundations of most of social science, but those of Marx, especially those of Marx, but not only, we're not proposing to abandon these, but to enrich them, to contextualize and reframe them. And for us, the scenes include fields, worlds, network elements, but the most decisive is to add more explicitly aesthetics as articulating values and cultural conceptions. This was refused, especially after 1968, when many said studying culture would blame the victims. But William Julius and Moynihan was the person who was most attacked as authoring the so-called Moynihan Report, etc. James S. Coleman was sanctioned and kicked out basically of the American Sociological Association because he was too politically incorrect. However, William Julius Wilson, the distinguished African-American sociologist at Chicago, then Harvard, reversed this position and slowly changed others. He has a new book on culture. Cities are an ideal way to lead the social sciences in these core elements. The molecular aesthetic, or toward a periodic table of cultural elements. What might a periodic table of cultural elements look like? Starting not with chemicals, but discrete bits of aesthetic sense, tradition, transgression, neighborliness. These are the Irish ethic. These are the ideas which we can see in Chicago neighborhoods. Bridgeport, why is Bridgeport so successful? Why did it manage to maintain legitimacy and to make things work in Chicago, even after the Irish were a tiny proportion of the voting group? Since the same aesthetic dimensions are potentially present in all empirical scenes, but vary in intensity from Beijing to Bridgeport, these qualities can and should be isolated from each other. So each pure ideal typical quality, local authenticity, transgression, self-expression, has its own character. An empirical city or neighborhood or an ethnic group is a unique combination of multiple abstract dimensions of scenes. That's the core argument of the book. How to identify these deep structures of scenes? We did not invent any of the 15 dimensions we use and measure and discuss. They come from centuries of poetry, novels, cultural theory, and philosophy, articulated by philosophers and political theorists. Although not a closed system, these 15 deep structures correspond to the chemical elements. And we call this our grammar of scenes. And I'm not elaborating much because Zach Taylor, Dan Silver, and others really do this with Chicago data. I'm giving you the sort of broader frame from which it emerges. And while Lévi-Strauss built his mythologique explicitly from Wagner, for his basic grammar of mythological elements, he added context, which we extend. A similar sensitivity is found in the classics, such as Weber's ideal types like the Protestant ethic or the overseas Chinese, Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, rural, urban, rural, urbane. Our 15 dimensions are explicitly general to, like these, to permit combining them into multiple empirical scenes, from Hyde Park to Bronzeville. This type of scenes analysis starts from such components as the geographic districts rather than only let me scroll down here a little more. Benjamin and Brecht. The world is flat, adding globalization. Okay, the death of distance is an illustration of the Brian Barry table I showed you at the beginning. People are recognizing that globalization is weakening the impact of the locality and of neighborhoods. But this we can see earlier in these kinds of factors which come together. For the scenes, we use not cities or nations, but also combined with zip codes and other local data smaller than that. Zach Taylor has even gotten down to voting districts where we can put these together, extending Levi-Strauss, but we use not a few, but hundreds of elements, thousands to create the scenes. The postal codes are available for over 40,000 units in the US, and similarly in much of the world. To find this powerful microdata, it's necessary to study in-depth, unpublished electronic archives, hitherto unseen. It's been in Chicago, it's been around in Chicago, but nobody used it in our group for 20 years. We also use the electronic yellow pages with hundreds of different types of restaurants, churches, hunting, and now social media and new internet sources, which add more options, which Zach and others will talk about. The techniques by which we convert these millions of bits of raw data into scenes dimensions for each neighborhood, I'll briefly illustrate with some more dramatic instances. We aim for, not always achieved, the subtlety of artists, but the coherence of scientists. New kinds of data like social media and internet downloads permit far more of both than in the past, like the digital humanities, which is now spreading even among people in the humanities who never talked to such things before. We don't have there's no necessary break. We need the qualitative and the quantitative. We need the coherence in the others. But we need the insights that all of these come together. There's a holism. That's the scene. Does this approach break with much previous work on culture and the arts and much of social science? We're living with changes comparable to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution or the French Republic, but more complex and subtle. The scenes are emerging as a concept from the transformations of 68 and 89. Increased education, global migration, the internet, new cultural ideals, but these are not universal. Specifics vary by little neighborhoods around the world and Chicago. We've schematized these major changes with the new political culture. Summarizing, as I showed you just briefly here, the NPC picture, within economic, within social, within cultural, and they all lead in this same kind of direction. And scenes extends this further. This is a break, most obviously, with the classic left-right wing ideological domination of cultural analysis for almost 2 centuries. Why is this perspective on the scenes new and relevant? In about 1800, Parisian leaders banned heavy industries when they realized they created smoke. The Parisians banned heavy industries. How could Paris survive as a city? People in London and Manchester, Birmingham were pumping smoke all over their cities, and they said, "Oh, this is the future." But they were pumping smoke. A new dynamic was theorized by Benjamin when he added the flaneur as a cultural engine. The archives transformed the shops into scenes. This was a rediscovery, as now people read this more as we enter a post-industrial era. The aesthetic prism is no longer limited to gentlemen with top hats on the boulevard. Democracy and egalitarianism join the technology of the smartphone music, clothes, tattoos as strong markers of identity that can reinforce and sometimes counter race, class, sex, and ethnicity. While the hierarchy withers, arts and political movements that focus on a bohemian single or anti-hierarchical give way to pluralism and issue specificity. This appears as the cultural relativism in the bottom box of figure 3 over here in this cultural pluralism, with more social and cultural tolerance in the development of new art forms and subtypes that press this. Some popular groups now use over 100 categories to define their music, from blues to house, and Chicago was a leader in both of these. 68 was not a Marxist revolution. It did not abolish capitalism. Some therefore saw it as empty. Yet it was a revolution of culture, aesthetics, equal participation, democracy, and identity. And it's led to the new social movements, to the political correctness of the current political and cultural scene, with a new label of diversity. Approximately 60 to 70% of Europeans, North Americans, and Japanese citizens support these major elements of a new political culture in gender, racial tolerance, and human rights.
Terry, we're going to
Globally-
go into obviously the details of the Scenes book in the next week, but I wonder if you could reflect, because you have this unique perspective on how urban sociology and the study of culture and the rest have influenced the Chicago School, or are part of making the new Chicago School, and how does this contribution come about that is shown not only in Scenes but in your earlier work on the new political culture?
Thanks, Dick. That's what I'm trying to do, and I've done that briefly now on the new political culture by showing you the box of these 3 boxes. And basically they're saying the classic left, right, or the machine reform need to both be included and recognized. That is, we have reform as well as traditional in the 20th century, and this is where the richer subtleties of the urban historians are critical, showing, it wasn't mentioned by Steve, but maybe I'm sure he can elaborate, roughly 10-15% of Chicago was the maximum number of white Protestants around in the early 20th century. We've never had WASPs dominant in this city. In some small elite institutions they are, but the point is, what's the dominant culture in the city council? That's what you've documented in detail, Dick. And the answer is the Irish ethic. White Catholics dominated, not just the Irish, although they were at the top, but Catholicism and the institutions of the church, the schools, mass, and so forth, combined with the Democratic Party, gave this style of legitimacy, which we've detailed, but which is now being completely challenged by other people. Tocqueville is being brought in as people migrate here from Boston, from New York, and other places. Or from Berkeley. We have new images of what's right and wrong. We have new conceptions of religion as central. And the majority of Brazilian, as well as not necessarily majority in Mexico, but there's a huge increase in evangelical Protestantism in Latin American countries and Africa, as well as Mexican Americans in Chicago. And these don't fit the Bill Grimshaw Catholicism model. But so there are conflicts among old and young within these groups. So the arts buzz I've had here just briefly. I don't want to. I'm making some linkages, and let me say just a word or two then on Tocqueville. As Tocqueville this was a subject of 10 years of meetings basically among these people, mostly Asian, of why doesn't Tocqueville work in Asia? And the second question was, why doesn't Benjamin and Jane Jacobs' work in Asia. They don't talk about innovation as linked with bohemia as stressed by the Europeans and the Americans. So consider two intermediate propositions. The Tocqueville proposition that citizen participation brings legitimacy and trust. Second, of Balzac and Baudelaire, the Bohemian fuels innovation. These two French-inspired theories failed when we first tested them in China, Korea, and Japan. And so the key summary point is that we need to join these with the context explicitly, and that the context should be an integral part of a theory in social science and in social history. That's holism. As decentralization and collegial engagement are essential for both theories, we develop this through documenting the rise of the arts, which, for instance, the major example of Putnam. This is total to use census data. There's no downturn here in recessions. This is not a cyclical process. This is the whole 20th. Well, I can't read the date here, but this went from 1939 to present. This is not a cyclical process. The survey data on RUA, this is the best data we have from the World Values Survey of Engelhardt. What are the kinds of organizations that you belong to? Arts and culture doubled in the US in this short period. US right here. The Netherlands tripled. France was roughly the same, but we show big national as well as local and regional differences. And Chicago initially did not have this so much in many areas, but it did in Bronzeville. Look at the folks on the left. They're not white. The conceptions, and this I say this to people in Bronzeville, I say, of course. People here want to be basketball players, and they want to they want a rap song. And my students doing ethnographic work in Black neighborhoods around the city continually are helping kids make rap music. There's a whole book on this among the culture of the gangs, which has come out. Okay, so Citizen values have more impact than many political systems with the spread of new global organizations. Like political systems, recent economies have been transformed by subject-specific niche markets. The iPhone generation label illustrates this. The details, panning on to get to answer Dick's question here, to contrast these patterns. The Chinese created a Scenes Academy in June 2020, just over a year and a half ago, launched with 4 hours of presentations viewed by 350,000 participants. This continues with regular meetings and over 180 publications on scenes in China already. In 2021, the Red Star Media organized a presentation on scenes which reached 60 million viewers. It was organized consciously 2 weeks before the 5-year plan was being drafted. And in February this year, there are 5 mentions of scenes. This was the first such 5-year plan to totally drop an economic growth goal like 12%, which the Chinese stressed from Mao right up to present. No longer is this even included as a goal in the 5-year plan. Instead, you have greening the environment, making cities more livable with specific policies and scenes ideas like nightlife. Chengdu is smaller than Beijing or Shanghai, but growing much faster, attracting more visitors, new innovative jobs, building explicitly on scenes concepts. But to link this then very briefly more again to Dick's question of how do these feed into what we're talking about here, both, and I'd say both in Chicago and nationally. We had the neighborhood focus from the 1920s continuing, and I'm coming back to stressing the neighborhood in the sense of these smaller scenes, not the whole city, as a brilliant thing, which is now possible empirically in qualitative field work, which has been done from the 1920s on, but at the same time with big data as well. The concepts in Chicago in political science, I would stress as well. Arthur Bentley and David Truman talked about group theory as central. And what were groups? They were not classes as in Europe. They said, this is not Europe. What do they mean? Poles, Irish, Blacks, ethnic politics. That's the core of Chicago theory. But the point is, they said this is American politics more generally, and Chicago in that sense is a model for North America in ways that conflict with a Marxist class domination, which is more the German-French tradition. So we have both everywhere, and we have the so-called New York school, the LA school, and the Chicago school, and Marxism and where it links with politics and culture is the centered difference, which is featured by Dick Simpson, Denny Judd, in our book Together on the Three. So the critical linkage then to history is the international background of immigration changed over the 19th century. When Tocqueville wrote, there were no immigrants apart from everybody came from the UK. The late 19th century totally changed this with Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh at the lead, where industrial leaders hired or paid explicitly, they helped people come here from Poland, Eastern Europe, and the like, not from the UK. And that made Chicago a very different city, as I mentioned. We didn't have WASPs after, there's Clark House, still on the south side, but no longer are WASPs the dominant political, in contrast to the private sector. So there's some private sector organizations like the Art Institute and the Symphony, which may have had some WASP domination. They clearly did. They excluded Jews for a while. Then the Jews created the Museum of Contemporary Art, and then the Art Institute said, "Oh my God, we need the Jews after all," etc. So these are going on within Chicago organizations as well. But the bigger theories that link with these include group theory, challenges to group theory, say with the Marxism and the Marxism and then the rational choice, so-called, which were also stressed at Chicago and in the APSA, but which can be joined. If we don't need to throw these out, we need to join them. As I mentioned, the new Chicago economics is doing this, and we can all, in all the social sciences, we need each other. Okay, I'm nearly there, but yes.
Maybe we could go to questions and
discussion. More general Q&A.
If you'll unshare your screen, we'll all be able to see the gallery. So we're back as a group. Steve, I don't know whether you have some commentary, and then the various people in the class, if you will unmute yourself and either make your commentary or ask your questions of either Steve or Terry.
I don't have anything to add. I love the way Terry pulled things together. I thought that was great. So I'll just wait for questions.
Okay, questions from anybody or commentary or things you need further illuminated? Come on, guys, you've been absorbing a lot. You must have some questions or some commentary.
I have a question.
Great.
Regarding scenes. Did anybody try to apply the scene concept to poverty places, like poor places in Latin America, such as favelas and places that there's expression, there's certain amount of choice, but they're defined by constraints, so to speak, like economic constraints.
Yes, there was a woman who did a PhD here in the music department who studied specifically the music from the favelas, which was not performed only in the favelas, but around other neighborhoods in Rio and in both in Brazil and Argentina. So you have increasingly happening both as Bronzeville residents on Saturday night no longer stay in Bronzeville. They go to the north side and they fight the police, which is where we are right now with the looting and the arguments with the current mayor in Chicago. That's happening as well in all over Latin America, as the favelas are having more residents who are penetrating other neighborhoods. We've had many visitors from Latin American favelas that Dick and some of our other faculty here have continued in projects, and these are stressed. Okay, so yes, there's a lot of work on this, but I would add the music. I mean, how important is music in Latin America? It's like Bronzeville. It's terribly important, and so the focus of this PhD was on how these are not dominated by the capitalism of big record companies. The individual favela musicians would post their own music on their websites and download it at prices they either for free, or as they got better known, they could set a price that they wanted themselves. So yes, it's absolutely central. Same thing, there's been a lot of work in southern Italy. Naples was a main focus of a PhD, and she's published a book. That's a book on Bogota, Naples, and Chicago, comparing the three and how elements of reform came to all three of these cities that were by the mayors, that these were not even though these could be partially bottom up from the citizens, they had mayors who captured these ideas and tried to use them in marketing their cities. So the mayor of Naples was a former communist, but he used the Communist Party nevertheless to stress the rise of tourism and the arts and fighting the mafia. And so in that is, the mafia would sell, the mafia had a monopoly basically on cigarettes and parking downtown. He broke those monopolies and in that way featured the open space and had the same kind of downtown Millennium Park architecture. The same, there's their pictures I have on another website of how this looks the same in both Naples and downtown Chicago.
Mitch, you had a question?
Yeah, it just in relation to scenes, especially like local scenes. How has TIF money absolutely like changed the narrative, or totally changed scenes in different parts of Chicago? I mean, we know that it's caused a lot of gentrification, but have you looked at the historical impacts of TIF?
Okay, that remains a controversial question and answer. And I know it well because I sat in a TIF appointed by Tony Preckwinkle, my alderman at the time, and a former student of mine. And I've had students work with her for 30 years, carrying her briefcase around, going to meetings, doing a BA or an MA, and documenting what she did. And she was fighting for reform like Dick Simpson in an era when nobody else was really doing reform. She was quiet about it, but she was doing it. And so it's ironic that she's not mayor, although she's going to run probably the next time around. And to try to distance herself from the people who she fought most of her career. She fought against the Burkes, the machine Burkes. And so the quick point I'm making is TIFs vary by alderman. And the aldermen in Chicago are little mayors, and the TIFs do very different things. So she created so I would have her come to class. Students would again and again and again say, "What's your policy on this?" And she would say, "We'll discuss it at the Baptist church in 2 weeks. Come on Saturday night and you can see, and the outgrowth of that will be my policy." And students didn't believe her, but that's what she did for a lot of her career, and she listened. So I would say combining the bottom up with, because once she adopted it, she would then fight for it. And so seeing that combination of bottom up and top down, that's the core of the new political culture. Political leaders see these are new ideas, they're citizen driven, they fight the organized groups like the unions or the ethnic organizations that don't respond to their own citizens. So the Mexican organizations tend to be Catholic and linked to traditional clientelism. But there's citizens, and there are some aldermen who are Mexican who are not. And so they fight among either they fight or they ignore each other. And the TIFs reflect all of this in different neighborhoods.
Yasmin, you had a question or comment?
Yes, thank you, Professor Clark, for a great lecture. So in your book, I run into this like question that asks like what kind of scenes people want to see or like want to live in. And there was at some point like a discussion of like political battles over multiple consumption and lifestyle concerns. And I was just like trying to project this perspective into a broader scene, like beyond the United States. So can you please tell us more about this? Tell us more about how strongly or weakly scene differences correlate with political affiliation and perhaps social movements as well.
Yeah, I mean, these are what we're in the middle of documenting. I mentioned there are 180 papers on China alone doing exactly what you asked for, many of them within China. So this is not an elite Western theory. This is embraced by, as I pointed out, the Chinese are the national leaders in embracing this kind of theory as they focus on making their cities better for their citizens, even though the Western press says virtually nothing about this. It's amazing. The books that I've gone over briefly, and I've got more PowerPoints, but there's not time to show all of this. We'll try to get this, but the Ken Tuckfield, the Scenescapes book is mostly Canadian and US. We have about 10 books in featuring also other countries, but the one which is the most visibly international and stresses some of these big changes is the book called Ken Tuckfield Karaoke. So I'd say take a look at that and the new political culture for specific international comparisons, which show you, how different is France from China and so forth. Hee-Sung Jong did a PhD with me and others at IIT, and then at the USC. She was a postdoc for a couple of years. She's done some brilliant papers on Bohemia in Paris, in Chicago, in Chicago-specific neighborhoods with qualitative and quantitative data, which she knows, and shows that they have more use of divvy bikes. They have more people riding buses. They go up Michigan, they go up riding Milwaukee, and they don't drive cars. They hate cars, and they're behind. And that's been a strong focus of Rahm Emanuel, Daley at the end, but Rahm Emanuel took it further, fighting the cars, building all these bike lanes, divvy bikes. And I've been to public meetings where I was amazed at how aggressive the bike folks are compared to the aldermen and the others. But they had the backing of Rahm Emanuel, so he lost as mayor. That is, he didn't run the last time, or the second time, but he did a huge amount for these policies.
Veronica, you had a comment or question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you can expand on the role that gentrification plays in the development of the scenes.
Yeah, that's a controversial question, and some people say this must be gentrification or the Bobos or whatever. My answer is the same as I made for it depends on the neighborhood. And I'm citing Bronzeville, and I've deliberately lived here because I learn every day. I'm working with the alderman, and I'm writing this, the key statement of what do we feature in a Bronzeville welcoming center, which is what we'll talk about next Tuesday. We have a 30-page document by leaders, ministers, cultural center folks, and this is the classic low-income African-American neighborhood in Chicago, which is one of the two national leaders. And we have bits of, okay, gentrification is not white replacing black in Bronzeville at all. There are some people who are higher in income, but there's like the TIF question, it depends. My quick answer is it depends on the context. So rather than saying there is or is not gentrification, the question is where and why do we have people raising or lowering income or staying the same? And we have all of these in different zip codes across the entire US. Gentrification is mostly in the big cities. It's minimal in many other areas of the US. There are books on just that. But but my quick answer is don't look for one thing. Look at it. If you're interested in gentrification, ask where, and the same thing. I'm taking this as a good general question. Why do we have right voting? Why do we have populist leaders? Why do we have unions? Contrast where and why in Chicago they're weaker or stronger. Use your more subtle knowledge of Chicago, of how this works in detail, and then look for some data nationally or internationally. So the Irish Ethic paper started with Chicago. I worked with a woman who did an MA just on interviewing political leaders who contrasted the Irish with Jews and with others in the Chicago City Council. So we had 150 pages of great interview data that were core in formulating how to analyze the rest of the other data, either qualitative or quantitative. But we need all of these.
So let's just highlight that a minute. One of the things that has proved useful, for instance, in my study of the city council, why was I able to study the city council? Because I'd been an alderman and I had to live from the inside. To the extent that you can learn about a particular topic and then produce in social science terms a hypothesis, and then produce the data or the evidence, it's either true or false, that inside view, that understanding is something that is often overlooked. And so that's Terry's approach with the example of the Irish paper, but many of the other aspects that he's illuminated over the years comes from first understanding it, usually knowing it, like his knowledge of Bronzeville, and then expanding that to a much broader theory where it's applied, for instance, in China. Mitch, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, just the same kind of theme of questioning again, and just trying to pick your brain on this one a little bit more. With like the talk of like investing in neighborhoods, right? And investing in, that's like a huge part of what Lori Lightfoot's campaign was based on, is like investing in the South and West side. Something that and a lot of what we've talked about in class too, just like taking a lot of that in, something I grapple with is how do you invest? Like what does a successful investment campaign look like that also doesn't gentrify, or like, that successfully keeps a theme, the scene that's, cherished in an area, in place, intact. I mean, do you have any, like, is Bronzeville an example of, an area, would you say? I'm just curious if or have any sense of like what a success of that looks like.
Yeah, this is a hot issue for sure in Bronzeville. Lori Lightfoot is mayor. I don't know if this is in what, I haven't heard this said about her, but I would suggest adding this and maybe more explicitly to what you're doing on the mayor's stuff. She has doubled the budget for the arts and culture in Chicago. I haven't heard the press or many others talking about it, but read about her director director or the culture director. He's a former faculty member, I think, at Columbia. Very smart guy, and what he says about this stuff is very informed by increasing spending, and they have something like 200 big grants for West and South Side for the arts. And so they're funding more activities with an explicit concern to feature more of the culture of African Americans and other, especially Mexicans as well, that are large and important in cultural activities, and to use these more explicitly. So this has not been featured enough, I would say, by our students. But I'm trying to say, look, and you find it in Chicago, right here.
Yeah, I know you had a comment or question.
Yeah, so in reading your book and in the reading I'm doing to prepare for the paper for this class, and in the previous question, gentrification is this huge issue that generates a lot of questions around it. And one of the things I keep coming back to is a feeling like it's not well defined or operationalized in these literatures. In your answer, you just referred to it in terms of economic displacement, but in the origins of the language, it's class displacement. So within your discipline or within the New Chicago School, when we talk about gentrification, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, my general point is to never argue about definitions, but look at what people are doing and point out that there may be, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different definitions of gentrification, and then discuss each of those dimensions separately and try to see where and how they either work separately. Do they have the same dynamics, or are they different? And then to do that, that is, if we think in those analytical terms, we can try to do that. But then in terms of evidence and policies, I've worked with people like Theaster Gates. I mentioned the Bronzeville Welcoming Center, but Theaster Gates is a potter, an urban developer, a very smart. He was named the most important influential artist in the world at the Vienna Biennale about 2 or 3 years ago, and he has been explicitly. He said he started with no money. His father was a roofer. He was an unknown guy for 20 years, and he's now taken off, and he's very, very well known. But the point is, he lives in these low-income areas himself. He knows how the people feel, and he wants to do this in a way that does not gentrify, but nevertheless tries to improve the economic and social and cultural well-being of the residents there. So, and he does brilliant web presentations. Look at some of his videos that are publicly available. In particular, there's an interview it was at the Aspen Center. The interviewer was a smart woman from Harlem, and she interviewed him about what she could take back to New York from what Theaster was doing. And it's a great interview. He's very frank and lots of examples in his other videos.
Other questions or comments?
I have a question. Like, how will be a good way to start thinking about or researching on these ideas that you were mentioning about Adorno's analysis of culture with advertisement and capitalism with in today's context? What do you think has changed, and what should be looking for the future in this sense?
No, these are, I mean, that's a very big, central, tricky question of how to capture this. One is to look at some, well, I'd say we're limited by if we want to do this, I mean, again, you hear me saying, use multiple methods, talk to people, get a feel, not just for one approach, but for others. I will add that at the time when Adorno said that, this was just before the 1968 disturbances. And the German students were saying, you should be more engaged in the specifics of action, Adorno. And his answer was to develop what he called critical theory. But critical theory was only theory. And he said, I will not stand on top of a car as Marty Lipset did at Berkeley and argue with the students. So Marty Lipset loved to have this kind of engagement. Fildovsky, they were New York, street fighters, and they were used to this from growing up. But Adorno was the opposite. He'd gone to Communist Party meetings in a Mercedes limousine with a chauffeur with Horkheimer. Okay, so they're writing atonal music. So the media are tricky and complicated. I would say look at the new social media, but who creates the new social media? CBS, NBC, and ABC? No, you do. You people are creating. You are the authors of what you put on your Facebook site, your Instagram images, and the similar things they have in China or France or Brazil. And so in that sense, the iPhone has huge political implications, not only for mobilizing people in parades, but giving people a sense that they can and do transform their political views. And so what the meanings of the media are very complicated and change from what Adorno had in mind. So capitalism gives you maybe a cheap cell phone, but it doesn't even have to be an iPhone. It can be Chinese or whatever else. And you can talk to your neighbors, and that is changing rural China. The rural Chinese major leisure activities are no longer playing mahjong and bowling in the village square. They are downloading films, talking on social media to their relatives and friends, and using the internet in other ways like this. We have surveys of this, of 40,000 Chinese across China, for instance. So I would say looking at some of the data like that, so the Chinese national government is the Ministry of Culture and the French, the Chinese and the French are doing, the government does this as a policy. We don't. We have no Ministry of Culture in the US. So we have local groups like Theaster Gates or Tony Preckwinkle that talk about it. But to measure this is the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, funds some research, but it's tiny compared to what the French and Italians are doing, and now especially the Chinese and Japanese. They've converted their national planning government focus into culture. They changed the name. The whole thing, that the Asian Miracle was the Japanese planning agency. It's changed its name to include culture. And I see Woo Jun Park's faces. He's paying attention. The Koreans are major global leaders in doing this. Two or three mayors have really embraced this. Then others threw them out. He quit. He quit after they did a referendum. He said, if I don't have 40%, I'll quit. He had 38% support in the referendum, so he quit. So these are controversial political issues. These are not subtle, things that you can only study with individual social media. Read the paper on Mayor Ford in Toronto by Dan Silver and a student. It's brilliant stuff. And Mayor Ford in Toronto was, dramatically featuring many of these issues, as did Trump nationally.
Thank you.
Or put differently, nobody has a clear, simple answer. If there were, Biden would follow it, and Biden would, but because we don't know, that is whether we are social scientists or citizens or political leaders, or what programs will, quote, work, the answer is there's huge diversity, and no one single program, no one single policy is embraced by everybody. There are many different issue-specific subtle differences, and recognizing that is the beginning of more subtle social science. 15% is what we're explaining. There's lots of noise.
Time for one last general question or comment before we switch to talking about your specific papers.
Yes, Steve, any other thoughts on how we could join our mutual thinking and presentation? That is, I've stressed that major transformation in Chicago is the patterns of immigration. Not only I stressed the late 19th century, but I would then stress, say, after the 80s, we have lots of cosmopolitan people who came here, sometimes called yuppies and others, but the term yuppie was celebrated and elaborated nationally from the Chicago Tribune, because Chicago bartenders used to say, "No yuppies in my bar," and so the yuppies were seen as. But yuppies now dominate Chicago, and I would say that's part of the. I'm throwing this out as a hypothesis for Zach and others to talk about. That is, this conflict within Toronto and within Chicago is documented and detailed, and the voters for Laurie Lightfoot were not the voters for Black political leaders in the last 20 years. She has a base which includes a lot of people who are the young urban professionals who are more highly educated, liberal, tolerant whites. There were lots of Black Lives Matter crowds on the north side, mainly consisting of whites.
Right. No, I agree, Terry. I think it is all about migration, immigration, and migration, ethnic communities, which, I didn't say it enough, but the new social history that subsumed urban history was largely about, re-examining and celebrating and understanding ethnic neighborhoods in New York and all over the place, and Chicago as well. And that's the type of study that I think is absolutely the most important to understanding ways of life in the community and really what's going on. And so it's what I really love about the Scenes approach here, is that it is also neighborhood based, and that's where the people live. And so there's quite a few links in that respect. But I also look forward to future projects too, because it is the type of research that, to pick up on what you've said, looking at many different things, asking different questions, and how people, different definitions, put that all together, and you've got a vibrant history, you have a vibrant community.
And they're neighborhoods that are not ethnic, but which are gay-based.
Right.
Boysville.
Exactly.
Sports-based around the Cubs. These neighborhoods have very distinctive subcultures, but they're not Polish and even there's a book on why the gayborhood is dying, because gays no longer need to meet in the street. They're using cell phones and connecting not in the street. So the people who don't know, only the people from suburbs or others who are not connected in that way go now to the gay. So the gay nationally, there's a book on this called, Why Gayborhoods Are in Decline across the whole US, because in a sense, I'm using that as an archetype for the Polish or the Mexicans, because they're breaking up into smaller subgroups.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And, from a historical perspective, I love the conversations on gentrification because it's not new. It's a different politicized debate about change in communities. And I think that's a good point, that they're not always ethnically based. They're based on characteristics of commonality.
So thanks very much, Terry and Steve. You're welcome to stay around. I want to take just a few minutes because I've been meeting with students about their papers, and I want to comment on that just a bit. But thanks very much for both presentations today, and both of you are, of course, always welcome here for the class. I want to say to everyone about their papers, because I've met with some of you now. So the first thing you have to do is pick a topic. And a number of you don't come from political science or the social sciences. And so it seems that some of what I'm asking you to do is not completely clear. So you pick your topic. And ideally it's a topic where in some fashion, the Chicago schools might be useful in unpacking it, but it doesn't have to be on Chicago. For instance, one of you is doing a paper on Rockford, which essentially repeats the Pierre Devise and William Julius Wilson studies of race and ethnicity and the declining middle class. One of you is doing a study of Berwyn. All of that's fine, but you need a topic. And once you've got the topic, you need to end up doing what's called literature review. That is, you need to read what other people have written about the topic. And from reading what other people have written about the topic, that should allow you to produce a hypothesis. And that you may think the hypothesis is true, or you may think the hypothesis isn't true, but it's a clear hypothesis of what one would expect based on what has already been studied on the topic. Once you've gotten some hypotheses, for instance, to paraphrase Mitch's earlier comment, TIFs are destroying the neighborhood or something like that, or leading to gentrification or whatever. You've done the background research, you've produced a specific hypothesis. And this is where I think people coming from other disciplines have a little more trouble. A hypothesis in the social sciences is an if-then statement. If such and such happens, then so and so will occur. And that can take a variety of forms. It doesn't have to follow exactly that formulation, but that allows you to put it into a pretty tight form. So once you've formulated a hypothesis, for instance, race and income are linked in Berwyn. And in Berwyn, all of the efforts by the local government to be able to improve, to integrate, or to make Berwyn more even and not having a widening color gap. Then, if that's the hypothesis, then you need to figure out what kind of evidence could be produced about this topic. There can be quantitative evidence and qualitative evidence, and Terry particularly cited some of it, and Steve, particularly in all of his, was mostly talking about qualitative, other than for that one historical period when they got quantitative as historians. And that period tended to go by fairly fast. So what data? We're not going to ask you to do the study. That's your PhD dissertation, or that's a major paper somewhere else. But we're going to ask you what data exists. So for instance, if you're studying Berwyn or if you're studying Rockford, census data exists. Census data is very useful to themes like race and themes like economics, and whether it's changed in the last 10 or 20 years is relatively easy to obtain, by looking at the census data, which gets down to both a community area, which is sort of equivalent to a neighborhood, or it gets down to actual census tracts, which is even the most useful, which are closer to the zip code. They're even smaller than the zip codes that Terry is using in the Scenes book. So census data is one source of data. Interviews with public officials, say in Berwyn, is a useful thing to do. You don't have to interview all the public officials in Berwyn, you just need to interview one. What kind of questions would you ask them? What kind of qualitative answers would they get? How would that somehow allow you to test your hypothesis? It's either true or false. So quantitative data might give answers, qualitative data might give answers. The best of social science uses both at the same time in the same work, but it's a limited time, so you produce some kind of data, either qualitative, quantitative, or ideally both. And then you may speculate on what you would be likely to find, and some of you want to even get to some policy recommendations if the findings were true. Now that's just the general way of trying to begin to do your paper. And I'm finding it useful to meet with each of you individually. I have time from now to meet with some of you. I can meet with you Thursday or Friday. If you want to meet with me Thursday or Friday or next week, send me an email at simpson@uic.edu, and I put that in the chat so you, in case you need to find it. But why don't you give me your questions generally about papers? And Terry's still here and can help answer what might be a good approach. And then I'll let most of you go and just meet with you individually. So general questions about how to proceed on the paper if you have doubts about how to go about doing the paper. To questions about your individual paper will hold to my end of my sessions with each one of you. So general questions. Go ahead, just unmute yourself and ask. So everybody understands generally what to do. What's the biggest problem you're having in lining up your paper?
Figuring out how to root it well in the new Chicago school.
So it doesn't have to be perfectly rooted in the new Chicago school. It's perfectly, or the old Chicago school for that matter. It's, you know, one of the things is, are there any studies that have been done in the Chicago school on your topic? You know, if anybody who, not just our small actual membership of the group, but anybody who has been a Chicago trained scholar, whether they did their work on Chicago or not.
The challenge there is identifying how you can tell if someone is new Chicago school or not.
That's a trouble we have too. And there's a good bit of argument about it. So I think it's fine if you find someone who's had some Chicago background or Chicago approach. And it's also fine if you say, the new Chicago school is not adequate for doing this topic. Instead, you know, Marx or Weber or somebody else or some, you know, current scholar is a better approach, and this is why.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add, the more you can get to specific hypotheses, instead of saying it's the whole school, saying what's the role of income or what's the role of musical taste and where and how do these vary? Getting to those kinds of more specific things and then operational measures. You don't need to say, is this person a member of the official member of a school or not? And I'd say, I'd add one more point. Look for conflict, but look for competing hypotheses and then ways of potentially resolving those conflicts. That's exciting.
Other problems you're having in just trying to get to your paper? Make
Professor,
it work.
you
Yes,
talked
Jay.
about you talked about I think briefly applying Robert Dahl's theory on week 4, just 1 week ago. Could you repeat it here? I couldn't access week 4 recordings yet, so
Yeah, we haven't got the. We had some problems with some of the recordings, and we're still trying to load them up. We load them to YouTube and then back to Blackboard because we're trying to get them all on YouTube. So just to comment very briefly on Robert Dahl. Robert Dahl's political theory is pluralism. It's very much comes from the group theories that Terry was talking about, but he developed them further. The idea is there are competing groups and that no one group controls the city, any city. He was studying New Haven, but that certain groups like labor unions might be important in this area, the political party might be important in that, the downtown business elite might be important in this other decision. And this is in contrast to Floyd Hunter, who said there is an elite of just the businessmen with an occasional politician who rule the city. So it's a question of who has, Dahl is all about the question of who has power. Dahl then took his theory of who has power in the city. His book was called Who Governs, and then applied it to national groups like the United States and other places. And his theory was called pluralism.
I don't have any more specific questions, but I'll schedule a meeting with you
Okay,
Thursday,
that's
Friday,
great.
and come back.
All right. Other problems generally that everybody might share with their paper. If not, I'm going to dismiss our class for the day and meet with any of you individually who want to meet right now. Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Terry, especially for being with us today.
My pleasure. I look forward to the papers.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
So
Bye,
you're
everyone.
now all part of
Bye,
the official
everyone.
Chicago school. You'll
Thank
be
you.
producing papers for us.
So I think I'm on pretty good track with my
Okay, Dan.
paper. If you've got a minute to talk about it.
Yes, I do.
I think I'm interested in queer migration and the way that neighborhoods have moved through Chicago from the Tower Town area in the 20s to Boys Town in the
Mhm.
70s through 90s to Andersonville and what is driving that. I found a decent literature, particularly around Boys Town, mostly by Chicago area scholars, although not in political science.
That's fine. They don't need to be in political science.
I understood that to be the case, or I wouldn't have kept going. That tend to present one of two general theses of what drives movement out of Boys Town, that it's either gentrification or a post-queer moment where that sort of geographic locus is no longer needed.
So what I would suggest is maybe start the paper with the gentrification theory and show that the gentrification theory doesn't, the data that you're going to collect would prove that gentrification wasn't sufficient as an explanation, and then move to the second explanation and see what, you know, the thing that Terry was going on in his discussion about how social connection by media and so forth makes it unnecessary for everybody to be in Boys Town.
Right. So I.
Can you hear me here?
Yes,
I can.
go ahead, Terry.
Did I mention the paper by Hee-Sun Jung? Can you hear me on this or not?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, Hee-Sun Jung, Journal of Urban Affairs, paper about 3 to 3 years ago, has a discussion of those neighborhoods.
I have it on my reading list already. I haven't gotten to it yet, but I do have it.
Yeah, this may not be on the reading list, but her name is Hyesun, Hee-Sun Jung, Jeong, Urban Affairs Review.
No, yes, it's on my reading list that I have
Oh,
developed. on this
okay,
topic.
okay, fine. That's great.
So I've done research in this area before. Data is always the challenge because it's not on the census, it's not on any city records.
Right.
You cannot track queer migration through direct measures. You have to use proxies. I've taken a trip over to Gerber Hart, and they've got copies of a number of queer publications, and I'm thinking about maybe trying to look at the addresses in ads. And
The other thing you might, particularly with Gay Life publications, maybe you could get their subscriber list. By
that's a
going,
thought that hadn't even occurred to me that might be possible, but I can at least check.
and
those
they
things
were in
tend to-
existence for 2 or 3 decades. So you
Having worked for organizations of this nature in the late 90s and early aughts, I can also tell you that they tended to be hyper hypersensitive to privacy issues. And so those things may not have been preserved, but it's worth looking at.
And they may also be only willing to give it to you anonymously and so on, and they may not have made them anonymous, you know, there's all of
Yeah.
that, but that's at least a possibility.
It's definitely worth pursuing because business locations is definitely an imperfect proxy, to say the least. But as far as the center of a commercial district, it might be a decent measure to show movement. So my thought was look at business locations, divide those. I don't know exactly, maybe by wards, maybe by census tract, something of that nature, and use a directed dyadic approach.
You can also do qualitative interviews with people like Tom Tunney, who's the, you know, openly declared gay alderman for the longest period that we, you know, had a consistent period of, and has been a major figure, one of the supposed four that were central to the development of gay political power, and so on. So you wouldn't have to do all of them. All you do was show that a qualitative interview with one of these kind of people.
I feel like the existing literature leans heavily on qualitative techniques,
Mhm.
and that what I can bring to it to expand our understanding is a more rigorously quantitative approach.
That would be wonderful.
So what I was thinking of doing was looking at a directed dyadic approach by some small division that makes sense, and I'll need to think about the theory and what small division makes sense, with dyad year unit of observations to look at how businesses are moving from one place to other places and what might be driving those. So I could use real estate values as a proxy for gentrification. I could use police incident reports as a proxy for level of policing. I need to find something that might help me measure this post-queer thesis, hypothesis. But
why not do a survey on social media and see what kind of hits you get? You know, maybe one of the groups that uses social media that's, you know, like the Center on Halsted or somebody.
Right.
You know, it would at least be a thing you could do, even if no matter what the response rate is, it would be, you know, better than zero, which is what we have now.
Well, and a simple year count actually might account for the growth of social media in a model. I don't know. These are technical things I'm still mulling over and thinking about.
It is a research design paper, so it's not expected that you're going to finish with a published document at the end, because we have limited time.
But I think I'm on track.
Yeah,
track on a good project.
Yeah, if you do this, it'll be fine.
One of the most famous papers close to this was Richard Florida and Gary Gates, where they argued that the percentage of gays was a major indicator of tolerance and in turn of the rise of technical high-tech jobs across the entire US. Then I and a few others began to look at I got their actual data, reanalyzed it, and found it was spurious. And the two papers are published in the book, that I edited, called The Cities and Entertainment Machine. And so you have the Florida Gates paper and then the refutation in my next chapter. And if you look at Richard Florida on the web, this is cited as a refutation of one of the most central theories of Florida.
Well, do you know what they were using as a measure? Was it the same-sex couple data from the census?
Yes.
That's a horrible, horrible measure, and everybody uses it.
Okay. No, but for sure. But that's why we're talking about multiple methods. All methods, all data have their weaknesses, for sure.
Well, the measure only makes sense if you presume that people in relationships are homogeneous with people not in relationships, which defies all logic.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Well, it sounds like you're on a good track, Dan. So
Awesome.
just
Thank you.
plow ahead.
All right.
Thank
Have a
you.
good week.
Thank you. Thank you again, Terry.
Good stuff, Dick. And to see that at least we're the new Chicago school, the two of us. See,
It may not be much bigger, but the two of us.
Great. Okay. Delighted to participate.
Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.